To discuss this, I was joined earlier by Liberal frontbencher Michael Sukkar, former head of Parliament's Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, and the son of Lebanese migrants. He's also a Conservative and gave us a few not-so-subtle messages for his own party. Michael Sukkar, thank you so much for joining me.
Great to be with you, Andrew.
The Brighton terrorist, Yaqub Khaira, was a Somalian refugee. The past 3 terrorism attacks were by Muslim refugees in Australia. Why did the Turnbull government defend ASIO boss Duncan Lewis when he said there was absolutely no connection between the refugee program and terrorism?
Well, Andrew, I mean, I've already stated publicly that clearly there is a connection between terrorist events that have occurred in Australia and terrorist events that have occurred in comparable countries like the United Kingdom most recently, and refugee programs, migration programs. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt about that. If you look at every single person convicted of a terrorist offence in this country, they either are directly or they're the direct descendants of somebody who was a migrant to this country, either predominantly through the refugee program or more broadly. So, I mean, Duncan Lewis did clarify his statements when he started to referring to categorising terrorists as those who really subscribe to a virulent form of Sunni Islam. And I have said publicly, and I'd repeat it, that those people almost exclusively have emanated from our refugee program. So these are self-evident truths. Unfortunately, there is a view out there that we need to buy into sort of this politically correct narrative and not call things as we see them. I don't buy into that, and I don't think members of the Turnbull government buy into that either. So I'm not saying anything to you that is controversial. I think what I'm saying to you is a self-evident truth, and the Australian people expect us to be straight with them, and we are now facing this global Islamic insurgency. The Islamic State ideology and structure is such that one individual with a truck or a car or a knife can be inspired by that virulent extremism and cause untold damage.
But what I'm most surprised is the Turnbull government defending his initial comment. Malcolm Turnbull, even today, said the question is why Khaira, the Brighton terrorist, was on parole. He was on parole when he did it. Isn't the real question, the most urgent question for us as a nation, why he and other refugee terrorists were ever let into Australia in the first place?
Well, Andrew, my understanding is he arrived here as a young child, and I think that it is very fair for the Prime Minister to ask that self-evident question: why was he on parole? You know, there are in other contexts, there are those who argue that Victoria under the Andrews government is effectively a lawless state and has become so. We see that with the Apex gang and other things that are going on. The bigger question that I ask, and in a former role I was the chair of the Security and Intelligence Committee, and while I was the chair of that committee, with really strong support from the Prime Minister, we introduced legislation which would keep people in jail who have these ideological beliefs even after their sentence is finished. I'm only speculating here, and it is a bit too early, but I just wonder, looking at this offender's background, whether he has been radicalised even further in jail. I mean, I know he beat terrorism-related charges in 2009, which I think we've got to ask questions about anyway.
He was radicalised before he went into jail, but the issue really is...
But potentially further radicalised, Andrew.
Look, correct. Everything you say is true, except, of course, we import people who are more likely to be succumbing to radicalisation. That's the issue. We're actually building a bigger pond in which the recruiters can fish. That doesn't seem to me to make sense.
Well, Andrew, again, when I say that there's a self-evident truth here, that those who have been convicted of terrorist offences in this country are either directly products of the refugee program or descendants of someone, we are talking about, in a sense, a legacy here. I mean, there was a period of the Labor government in the 80s where really the vetting protocols were thrown out the window, and we had...
Also under the Howard government, the Somali and Sudanese refugees are primarily brought out by the Howard government, and particularly Immigration Minister Amanda Vanstone, and you say it's historic But you're the government that's bringing in 12,000 refugees from the Middle East and, oh yes, okay, a lot of them are Christian, but a lot also are not. I want to know, there's also a huge crime wave in Melbourne by Sudanese refugees and their children. Huge. 130 times more likely, for instance, to commit an aggravated burglary. Gun crime also are the children of Lebanese refugees from the 70s. Is our refugee program an unambiguous danger to Australians?
Well, Andrew, I'd answer that by saying we have to ensure that our special humanitarian program, our refugee program, acts in our best interests.
But it's not. It's plainly not. We have a crime wave by children of refugees in Melbourne. We have had historic gun crime by children of Lebanese refugees in Sydney and in Melbourne. We've got 4 terrorist attacks now, lethal terrorist attacks by the children or refugees themselves in Australia. Clearly, it is not operating in our interests. When is the government going to admit this?
Well, Andrew, there are many people in the government, such as myself, Minister Dutton, others, who do speak very plainly and very frankly about these issues. I think if you ask the average Australian in the 1980s or 90s that what we're seeing today was going to be a natural consequence of certain migration, then clearly I think most Australians would say, well, you need to change that. That's a very bad idea.
The point is that these warnings were there. Malcolm Fraser, when he let in the refugees from the Lebanese civil war, was warned by the immigration minister, this is dangerous. When the Somali and Sudanese refugees were let in by the Howard government, Kevin Andrews said, this is dangerous. We are warning, but even the Liberals have been deaf to those warnings.
Well, Andrew, I disagree, because if I look at our current refugee program, even the 12,000 Syrian refugees that you speak about, we were criticised by the Labor Party for taking far too long in bringing them in. But that was largely because the vetting processes were extraordinarily thorough. And in that case, the vast bulk, about 75% of that intake were persecuted minorities, predominantly Christians. And we have said, let's rebalance our program to those who share our values,
and that is good.
And it must be a values debate. It's not about. It's not a religious or sectarian debate. If you subscribe to the values that underpin this country, you're welcome. If you prefer Sharia law, well, guess what? There's a lot of countries out there that have got Sharia law. Go and live there. Don't live here. I mean, this is what this government, our government, the Turnbull government has said. And the Abbott government previously.
It's a welcome change, and you know, and I'm conscious with all this debate that we must not demonise refugees. You're the son of Lebanese migrants, right? Not refugees, migrants. Now, all right, Maronite rather than Muslim, but so I'm aware of the sensitivities here. But the point is, you said you've stepped up the screening. Great. You put cultural factors higher. That's great. But here, this boy, or this terrorist who was killed, is the son of refugees, brought himself as a refugee, but as a boy.
Yeah.
You can't screen the children. This idea that we're protected by screening is a nonsense, isn't it? Because you can't screen the children.
Well, and that's the vexed issue we're dealing with now. We're dealing with either people who have grown up here for most of their lives or in many cases were born here. And this is why I think we have to fight this on a cultural basis as much as we do on ensuring that the right people come to this country. And
you don't think we should scrap the refugee program until we can prove that we can deal with the refugees we've taken in here? Wouldn't our money actually go further if we helped refugees in the countries where they are now, rather than bringing a lucky few in here at great expense?
I am coloured by the view that I know the work that Peter Dutton is doing, and if there's one person who you trust, you know, in charge of our immigration and border protection, it's Peter Dutton. Now, a different minister at a different time, I mean, if I look at the former Labor ministers, Chris Bowen and Tony Burke, perhaps I'd have a lot less confidence.
The point is, this guy was brought in by a Liberal government. This guy.
Sure, but the point is, Andrew, and we've spoken about this in the past, there's a perverse coalescing between the sort of radical hard left who view sort of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and they make every excuse under the sun for people who really have views that are incompatible with our society. And
You're correct.
you know, I probably get away with it a little more than others. Being someone who is the son of a Lebanese migrant, I can speak a little more plainly. But for a fifth or sixth generation white Anglo-Saxon Australian to say some of the things I say, watch their Twitter feed. I mean, they will be called every name under the sun, a racist, a bigot.
Hey, you're
And,
talking to me, I know this.
you know, so it makes it very difficult to have this values debate. But we must, and I mean, Theresa May spoke about it. We can't have, we can't in any way go easy on these people, and we've got to fight them in the cultural battles. And the way to do that is to say, Western liberal democracy is the best form of society, and we mustn't be shy about that.
You guys spend $1 billion a year on the ABC, which trashes our institutions, our traditions, our even our symbols. So I don't get this. This needs to change. This Liberal government, right? And I know you're a Conservative, so I'm certainly not blaming you, but you've given us a Labor-like budget, high spending, high taxes. You're now likely this week to endorse a finding by Chief Scientist Alan Finkel for even deeper cuts to the global warming emissions of our power stations. Cuts that Labor now says it could endorse. It has actually said it could endorse these and end this war between you and... You know what that means? You've got then, if you go ahead with this, and a global warming policy that even Labor approves of, and you have removed your biggest weapon going into the next election, which is about power prices. How can you possibly think of this?
Well, Andrew, I have far less confidence that the Labor Party is going to agree with anything we do. I mean, Minister Frydenberg in recent days has brought forward a policy that would enable carbon capture and storage.
Carbon capture and storage is a fool's goal. The Greens are right. This is the one thing they're right on. That doesn't work. You've spent $1 billion or more on it. It doesn't work, and it just drives power prices up. Labor.
Well, I'm surprised that you're adopting the lines of the Greens. This is not theoretical. There are, as we speak, there are power stations that do sequester carbon from coal.
Yes, you can get anything you like, provided you pay enough. This is the issue. If you pay too much, Australians will lose their jobs, their power prices will go through the roof. That's the issue.
But Andrew, my point here is don't think for 1 minute that anything we come up with or anything that Minister Frydenberg comes up with, Bill Shorten is going to agree with.
If he ticks off on it, you guys will have thrown your weapons out the back door. You will have a Labor energy policy as well as a Labor economic policy. You guys will be toast.
Well, I don't agree. I think the next election we will be... there will be two very stark policies, and I'm confident that ours will be for more secure energy, lower prices. Of course, you know, we've got a...
I hope they listen to you, Michael.
We've got a seminal moment
your
coming
colleagues
up,
listen to
but
you.
I think we've passed that test. We've passed the difficult test in this policy space before.
Yes, that was under Tony Abbott, not
we'll
under Malcolm Turnbull. Last thing about this Liberal-Labor thing. Julie Bishop, Slash is trying to be the Gillian Triggs of the Liberal Party, has formed an advisory committee to get her to examine how our Australian business leaders can be brought more into compliance with United Nations human rights treaties. And on this advisory committee is Jenny George, the former Labor MP and former ACTU secretary. And the Human Rights Committee of the UN is populated by the likes of Cuba, China, Saudi Arabia. What is this?
Well, Andrew, I suppose lots of Australians, including myself, have significant reservations with the United Nations.
You should have significant reservations with Julie Bishop.
I think when we saw Gaddafi's Libya chairing the Human Rights Committee, I think at that point that was the straw that broke the camel's back.
It didn't break
so
Julie Bishop's camel at all.
You know, I believe, like those in the UK who have voted for Brexit, I believe in the primacy of our democracy and the primacy of our parliament to pass laws, not for the United Nations to impose laws on us through treaties in that way. So I'm not entirely familiar with what you've raised, but I'm, you know,
She snuck it out last
I will
Friday.
give the Foreign Minister the benefit of the doubt because I think
That's a mistake.
I think in this space again, we have shown as a government that that these sort of hollow.
Mate, look, if you've got Jenny George
symbolism-
advising your government on how to be more compliant with the UN, why don't we just vote Labor and be done with it instead of this fraud? But Michael, I'm so glad that you're there putting these little markers there, and I do hope that other Liberal ministers are listening. Michael Sukkar, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Andrew.